Just a quick recap on what we did about abnormality. So by the end of this video, we should be able to describe the different ways we've got of defining abnormality, apply these definitions to a couple of case studies from real life, and evaluate the two ways. So if you just remember, there's two different ways that we define abnormality. First off, statistical infrequency, and secondly, deviation from social norms. So that first one, statistical infrequency, if you remember, has everything to do with this normal distribution curve. First off, remember that anything which is statistically infrequent is seen as abnormal. That's kind of the headline of this idea. Anything that's infrequent is abnormal. So we've got this normal distribution curve. If you remember, we can plot all kind of scores on this chart. So let's say the example we keep using is IQ. The mean, mode and median of IQ is always 100. The average person or the average score is 100 in both mean, mode and median. And the majority of people will fall within a set distance from this. So the majority of people, 68.26%, fall within one standard deviation either side. So that's 34.1% either way. So if we're talking about standard deviation, it just literally means how far people are away from this average. With IQ, we are talking about 15 IQ points. So 34% of the population will be between 85 and 100 IQ points. 34% of the population will be between 100 and 115, given 68.26 in total. Two standard deviations adds an extra 13.5% on either side. Remember, this is just a mathematical process that shows us that when we have this mean, mode and median at the middle point all the same, this is how things will tailor off from there. So anybody that's more than two standard deviations away is where we normally cut off the line, is abnormal. So these 2.28% of people this side and this side would be classed as abnormal. They are statistically infrequent, so we class them as being abnormal. Again, IQ is always the example that we use. This just has in words what I've just said, if you want to make notes on this. So remember, whatever behaviour is infrequent is classed as abnormal. We can do this with schizophrenia, and we can do it with scores on a particular depression test, that DAS test. So strengths and weaknesses of this, it's a quantitative, objective, reliable method. So we are not being unfair in doing this. We are seeing that we are giving it a numerical score. Something that we're not interpreting, we're not influencing it. It's literally the percentages of the population. This is how we're defining what is abnormal. Therefore, it makes it objective. It makes it kind of more scientific and gives us evidence for things like that as well. The problem, though, is that it doesn't take into account desirability. So IQ, we don't really class it as being abnormal. Even though it fits this definition, if you've got a very high IQ, we don't class you as being abnormal. So there's something where there's kind of a bias or a validity problem involved with it. Remember, some behaviours are quite statistically frequent now. So depression affects a large proportion of the population. Some people have suggested that the majority will have it at some point in their lives. So it's not really fair to class that as being an abnormality if we're saying it's about statistical infrequencies. Remember, there's a point that's not on this slide, that this is an arbitrary cutoff point. So arbitrary cutoff points are a problem because even though they are fair and unbiased and things like that, and that's the big strength of this, it's not exactly the most valid way of doing it. Somebody with an IQ of 85 is seen as normal. Someone with an IQ of 84 is seen as abnormal. When really the kind of functioning of somebody with an IQ of 84 and the functioning of somebody with an IQ of 85 is no difference. So we've said that one is abnormal and one is not abnormal simply because we have to have somewhere to draw the line. And that's kind of wrong on a valid point, validity point, because these people aren't that different. So it's not really fair to say one's normal and one's abnormal when there's no difference between them really, in real terms. The second definition is the deviation from social norms. So remember, every group, every society has these social norms, accepted ways of behaving. And these are affected by lots and lots of different things that we're going to cover. But basically, every culture has accepted ways of behaving. And if you break these accepted ways of behaving in your culture, you are seen as being abnormal. So behaviour which breaks these social norms or moves away from what is considered socially normal is considered abnormal. So there are various things that affect it. So the effects of culture, context, age, gender, and historical context. So just a few diagrams to demonstrate this, and I'll talk about it a bit more. So remember, what we consider kind of body mutilation, other cultures might not. The key example we can always use for the effect of culture is hearing voices. Yeah, in some cultures, we see that as being a mental illness because they're not really there, whereas other cultures, they view it as a sense of kind of spirituality. So what we might consider abnormal of hearing voices, other cultures don't. This is also an important one when we talk about things like culturally bound syndromes. So remember, there's some illnesses that we only see in other countries and not in our own, and vice versa. So the illness you have does depend to some degree on where you're from. This, remember, also influences diagnosis. So there was those studies that showed that people of Afro-Caribbean backgrounds are more likely to be diagnosed with mental illness in Britain than white people because of cultural differences. Their cultural attitudes or something breaks our social norm, so we consider them to be abnormal when in their own culture they aren't. The effects of context. So remember, it is perfectly reasonable to wear a fancy dress costume to a party or a Halloween. It would be very strange to wear it to a funeral. Behaviour that is okay in one situation is not okay in another. And if somebody was to bring the behaviour into a situation where it was not normal, we would class them as abnormal, even though their behaviour was perfectly reasonable somewhere else. The effects of age. So remember, it is perfectly acceptable for a toddler to have a tantrum, not for an adult. And again, this is just a question of validity when it comes to these social norms, that it's okay for one person or one group of people, but not okay for another. Same sort of thing with historical context. So remember, it was a crime and a mental illness to be homosexual up until the late 60s, or indeed to be an unwedded mother, things like that. So we can look at that and say that that is a factor in a social norm. The same thing for effects of gender. What we might class as normal for a male may be different to that of a female. There's various studies like Ford and Whittaker and Broverman which show how these gender stereotypes that we've got, these gender norms, can influence what we diagnose as being mentally ill or not, and what we class as being abnormal or normal. And they are on the PowerPoint slides to do with that when we come to DSM and diagnosis. So strength, makes sense. This is our common idea of what is mentally ill. People who break social norms and kind of make us uncomfortable to some degree. It explains cultural relativism, or cultural bound syndromes. It explains why they are seen in these other cultures, because they're breaking those social norms. Weaknesses of this, though, is that it makes it very hard to define what is abnormal. If every culture, every group, every gender, every age range can have its own norms, then are we really comfortable as classing somebody as being abnormal just because they don't fit into the group that they are currently in, when really they might be totally normal? If you can get along perfectly reasonable in other cultures hearing voices in your head, why do we have to consider it as an illness? Two more points that we always make is it doesn't deal with all kind of abnormalities. So it is socially abnormal, it breaks social norms to be a criminal. But we don't consider these people to be abnormal, or we definitely don't consider them to have a mental illness. So again, there might be that concept of kind of desirability of these behaviours. And finally, a guy that we should definitely quote, Thomas Szasz. Thomas Szasz, in The Myth of Mental Illness, said that there is no such thing as mental illness, just problematic people. So every time somebody's breaking these social norms, it just makes us uncomfortable, and because of that we label them and we punish them. They're not doing anything wrong, their behaviour might be perfectly reasonable, but we don't like it. And that is not a good way for a society, or particularly for a medical community, to function. These are just a couple of bullet points that summarise it. And that is pretty much both of those definitions with some evaluation points. I'll just quickly fast forward through them, and that is it. Right, so thanks very much. Hopefully this helps, and bye.